Kansas Territory, 1872. The wind howled across the wide plains as Francesca Tate tightened her grip on the reins, her heart hammering harder than the storm clouds gathering in the distance. She had been riding since dawn, chasing the trail of the man who had destroyed her life. Revenge was the only thing keeping her upright in the saddle, the only thing keeping her breathing. She reached the ridge, her dark eyes scanning the valley below. A small, crumbling town sat hunched against the hills, the kind of place where desperate men disappeared. Her target was here. She could feel it as sure as the ache in her bones. Francesca swung down from her horse and tied the reins to a gnarled post sticking out of the ground. She checked the pistol strapped to her thigh, the knife in her boot. Her father had taught her how to fight before he was gunned down in cold blood. That memory burned hotter than any sun. As she made her way toward town, dust swirling around her boots, she barely noticed the man leaning against the watering trough, watching her with careful eyes. He looked like he belonged here, dust-stained boots, worn hat pulled low, but there was something different about him. Something quieter, kinder. Looking for someone? His voice was low, and it carried easily over the empty street. Francesca kept walking. Not your business. He pushed off the trough and followed a few steps behind, hands loose at his sides. Name is Quentin Grady. I do not mean any harm. She stopped, turned slowly. The name stirred something in her memory. A bounty hunter. One of the good ones, if there was such a thing. She had heard of him when she first started tracking her father's killer. I am not looking for help, Francesca said sharply. Stay out of my way. Quentin met her glare without flinching. His face was rough with stubble, but his eyes were soft. Looks to me like you could use someone watching your back. Francesca opened her mouth to argue, but a flash of movement from the saloon window caught her attention. She narrowed her eyes. There. She recognized the man's hunched shoulders, the way he limped slightly when he walked. Without thinking, she pushed past Quentin and headed for the saloon doors. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and cheap whiskey. Men lounged at the tables, their laughter harsh and mean. Francesca spotted her quarry at the far table, a bottle clutched in his filthy hand. She strode across the room, ignoring the catcalls and whistles, and slammed her fist onto the table. The man looked up, confusion clouding his bloodshot eyes. You remember me? She said, her voice like steel. He squinted, then paled. Tate, he rasped. I thought you were dead. Not yet, she said, and drew her pistol. The saloon went dead silent. Before she could pull the trigger, a rough hand grabbed her wrist. Quentin. His grip was firm but not hurting. His eyes met hers, full of something she did not recognize. Understanding. Mercy. You do this, there is no going back, he said quietly. Francesca yanked her arm free, shaking with rage. He murdered my father. And you will rot in a jail cell for it, Quentin said. That what your father would have wanted? Tears blurred her vision. She hated him for making sense. She hated herself for hesitating. Behind her, the killer shoved back his chair and lunged. Francesca tried to twist away, but he was faster. His knife flashed toward her side. Quentin moved like lightning, stepping between them. The blade sliced his jacket, but he did not slow. He pinned the man against the wall with brutal efficiency, wrenching the knife away and slamming him face first onto the table. Someone fetch the sheriff, Quentin called out without looking up. A few men scrambled out the door. Francesca stood frozen, breathing hard. The rage that had been her only companion for so long was slipping away, leaving her hollow. Quentin looked over his shoulder at her, blood trickling from a shallow cut on his arm. You are safe now. Something broke inside her. She sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. Later, after the sheriff had dragged the killer away and the saloon slowly returned to its usual noise, Quentin found her sitting outside on the wooden steps. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the storm clouds gone. You did good, he said, sitting beside her. Better than most would have. Francesca shook her head. I feel like I lost everything all over again. You did not lose, Quentin said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, offering it to her. You chose to live. She took it with trembling fingers. I do not even know how to live anymore. He smiled a little. Not mocking. Just kind. Maybe you let someone show you. Francesca stared at him, the weight of her grief pressing down. But there was something about Quentin Grady that made it a little easier to breathe. Why would you help me? She asked. His smile faded into something more serious. Because I know what it is to lose everything. And I know it does not have to stay that way. The wind stirred a lock of her dark hair across her face. Quentin reached out and tucked it behind her ear, his touch so gentle it made her chest ache. Let me help you, he said simply. Francesca closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the walls around her heart start to crack. When she opened them, she nodded. Quentin's smile returned, small but real. He stood and offered his hand. Francesca hesitated only a second before taking it. His palm was rough, warm, steady. Together, they walked into the falling night. The next morning came slow and golden, the sun slipping over the horizon like spilled honey. Francesca sat on the edge of the porch outside the boarding house, running her fingers over the worn wood. Her horse grazed nearby, its saddle slung over the rail. She had taken care to brush it down herself, needing the quiet work to steady her hands. Quentin approached with 2 tin cups, steam rising in the cool air. You got a long road ahead, he said, offering one. She accepted it, wrapping her fingers around the warmth without drinking. I don't even know where to start, she said, her voice rough from disuse. Quentin leaned against the post, one boot crossed over the other. Start small. Find a place to settle. Work honest days till the ground feels steady again. Francesca glanced at him. His shirt was clean but frayed at the cuffs, the cut on his arm bandaged neatly. He looked like he had lived a dozen lives already, each one carved into the lines around his eyes. I never thought past getting justice, she admitted. I don't have anywhere to go. He took a sip from his cup, thoughtful. There's a town west of here. Prairie Bend. Small but growing. Folks there could use a good hand. Maybe a seamstress. Maybe a schoolmarm. Francesca gave a short laugh, surprised at the sound. You think I look like a schoolmarm? Quentin smiled, slow and easy. I think you could be whatever you set your mind to. A wagon rattled by, the driver tipping his hat. Francesca watched it disappear down the dusty road, her chest tight with uncertainty. You planning to ride out too? She asked. Quentin shifted, the leather of his belt creaking softly. Hadn't decided. Was thinking maybe I'd head that way myself. Heard tell there's good work chasing down horse thieves. She studied him over the rim of her cup. You following me? His gaze met hers, steady as the plains. Only if you don't mind. Francesca set the cup aside, the coffee untouched. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore. You don't have to, he said. Just walk beside me a while. See what comes. The simplicity of it unraveled something tight inside her. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. All right, she said, squinting into the rising sun. But I ride my own horse and I make my own decisions. Quentin tipped his hat. Wouldn't have it any other way. They set out before noon, Francesca riding a few paces ahead, the wind tugging at the ends of her hair. The land stretched wide and open, the sky so big it made her feel small in a way that was almost comforting. For a long time, they rode without words, the rhythm of hooves and the creak of saddles filling the silence. Francesca found herself glancing back now and then, each time finding Quentin there, his presence sure and unwavering. As the sun dipped low, they made camp by a thin creek lined with cottonwoods. Francesca gathered wood while Quentin saw to the horses. When the fire crackled to life, she sat cross-legged on the ground, watching the flames dance. Quentin handed her a strip of dried meat. Not much of a supper, but it'll keep us upright. She took it, chewing slowly. The firelight caught the planes of his face, making him look even more worn, but somehow more solid. Why bounty hunting? She asked, the question slipping out before she could call it back. He tossed a twig into the fire, watching the sparks leap. Started out needing the money. Stayed because if I was gonna live by my gun, I wanted it to mean something. Francesca pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. You ever lose somebody? His jaw tightened, almost imperceptible. A brother. Lost him to a fever back when we were just boys. After that, it was just me and the trail. The honesty in his voice settled something inside her, something raw and aching. I lost my mother young, she said. Then my father. Well, you know the rest. Quentin nodded, the silence between them thick but not uncomfortable. You ever think about stopping? She asked after a while. He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of embers into the night. More lately. She didn't answer, but the thought lingered between them like a promise. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and bright. Francesca stretched out her bedroll a few feet from the fire, feeling the ache of the day settle into her bones. She watched Quentin as he settled down across from her, his hat pulled low. For the first time in a long time, she let her eyes close without fear clawing at her throat. Tomorrow would come soon enough. And for once, she wasn't dreading it. By the time they rode into Prairie Bend, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, a spring rain having passed through hours earlier. Wooden storefronts, still glistening in the sun, lined the main street. Children played barefoot in the puddles, their laughter rising above the clatter of wagon wheels and the lowing of cattle. Francesca kept her shoulders square as they passed the blacksmith and the general store, feeling the curious eyes of the townsfolk. Quentin rode beside her, offering no words, just the steady presence she had come to lean on more than she cared to admit. Near the far end of town, a woman in a blue calico dress waved them over from the porch of a boarding house. Her hair was pinned in a messy knot, and her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. You two looking for rooms? She called, wiping her hands on her apron. Francesca opened her mouth, but Quentin answered first. Just one, if it's got space enough. The woman nodded. Plenty of space. Most folks passing through don't stay long. Come on in. Inside, the place smelled of wood smoke and soap. A braided rug covered the scuffed floor, and a narrow staircase led to the upper rooms. Francesca followed the woman up, her boots whispering against the worn boards. After paying for the room, Quentin carried both their saddlebags upstairs. Francesca trailed behind, feeling the weight of the last few days settle deeper into her spine. The room was plain but clean, with a wide bed and a window that overlooked the town square. Quentin set the bags down carefully, then turned to her. You all right staying here a while? He asked. Francesca crossed to the window, looking out at the slow-moving life below. I think so. He nodded once. I'll see about finding work. Francesca watched as he shrugged into his coat and left, the door clicking softly behind him. Alone, she let out a long breath and sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped tight in her lap. Later, when he returned, he carried 2 wrapped parcels under one arm and a folded notice in his hand. Found something, he said, dropping into the chair by the window. Sheriff needs someone to track a missing herd. Offered decent pay. Francesca watched as he unwrapped the parcels, revealing bread, cheese, and a small jar of pickled vegetables. And you? Quentin asked, glancing up at her. She hesitated, then reached for the bread. The woman downstairs said the schoolteacher left after the last bad winter. They need someone to take over. Quentin's mouth curved in approval. You thinking about it? Francesca tore a piece of bread and nodded. I might. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that needed no filling. When the meal was done, Quentin leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. Would you want me to stay? His voice was light, but something in his face betrayed the gravity of the question. Francesca set down the crust she had been toying with. You already stayed longer than you had to. That wasn't the question. She studied him, the way the fading light caught the rough angle of his jaw, the steady way he held himself even now. Trust wasn't something she gave easily, but it had grown between them, slow and stubborn as prairie grass. I want you to stay, she said, the words tasting strange and new. Quentin's gaze softened and he nodded once, as if sealing an agreement made without ceremony. The days that followed unfolded quiet and steady. Quentin rode out with the cattlemen each morning, returning dust-covered and tired. Francesca spent her hours at the small schoolhouse, sweeping out mice nests and sorting through battered readers left behind by the last teacher. One evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, Francesca found herself standing by the creek that bordered the town. She had peeled off her boots and let her toes sink into the cool mud, skirts hitched up above her ankles. Quentin approached without a word, his steps careful on the soft bank. "You ever think about how you got here?" Francesca asked, not looking up. He crouched beside her, letting the water trickle over his fingertips. "Every day." She turned toward him then, seeing not just the man who had pulled her back from the edge, but the one who had waited, patient and steady, while she stitched herself back together. "I don't know how to be anything but angry," she admitted, her voice low. Quentin looked at her, the deep lines around his eyes catching the last of the light. "Maybe you don't have to be anything but yourself." Francesca let the words settle, feeling them root somewhere deep. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was careful, like he was afraid to break something precious. "You ain't alone anymore," he said. The truth of it rang through her, clear and sure. She squeezed his hand back, the first real smile in longer than she could remember breaking across her face. Quentin grinned in return, the kind of grin that made her heart ache in the best way. The water whispered around their feet, the stars beginning to blink awake above them. For the first time, Francesca understood that revenge had not given her back what she lost. But this quiet, steady thing growing between her and Quentin might just give her something she had never dared hope for. The spring deepened into early summer, and Prairie Bend stirred with the restless energy of planting season. Francesca spent most mornings at the schoolhouse, her days filled with the dusty scrape of chalk and the earnest voices of children learning their letters. Quentin, when not out riding herd trails, repaired the sagging fence around the schoolyard without being asked. One evening as Francesca locked the heavy front door of the schoolhouse, she found Quentin waiting beneath the cottonwood tree across the road, his hat held against his chest. "You got a minute?" he asked, voice low like he did not want to startle her. She brushed a dusty lock of hair from her forehead. "What's on your mind?" He shifted, the leather of his boots whispering against the dirt. "Sheriff asked if I'd help escort a wagon train heading west. Just a week's ride out and back. Good pay." Francesca felt a hollow open in her chest, but she kept her face still. "You should go, then." Quentin stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "I don't want to go without knowing what I'll be coming back to." The world seemed to still around them. Francesca heard nothing but the wind rattling the high branches above. "You'll be coming back to me," she said, her voice steady. Some of the tension in Quentin's shoulders eased. He reached out, letting his fingertips brush the back of her hand, slow and sure. "I'll be back before the next full moon," he promised. Francesca nodded once, the lump in her throat too thick for words. They stood like that, the last of the light painting their faces in gold, until the shadows grew long and cool. The next morning, Quentin mounted his horse outside the boarding house while Francesca stood on the porch steps, arms wrapped around herself against the unexpected chill. He looked different somehow, not just in the way a man looks before a long ride, but stronger, more certain. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled something wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it down to her without a word. Francesca peeled back the cloth and found a small book, the leather worn smooth by years of handling. She traced the faded lettering with her thumb. "It was my brother's," Quentin said. "He always said a man ought to leave something good behind when he goes." Francesca closed the book carefully. "I'll keep it safe." He tipped his hat and turned his horse toward the open road, the sound of hooves fading into the morning mist. The days without him stretched longer than she expected. Francesca threw herself into her work, patching the schoolhouse roof with the help of the oldest boys and stitching new curtains from a bolt of calico the storekeeper sold her cheap. At night, she read from the book Quentin had given her, the pages filled with psalms and weathered notes in a steady hand. One evening, as she swept the schoolhouse floor, the door creaked open. She turned, heart leaping, but it was only Mrs. Alder from the boarding house. "You're expecting someone?" the older woman said, her mouth tugging into a knowing smile. Francesca set the broom aside. He's coming back. Mrs. Alder leaned on her cane, watching her. You love him. The words hit like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her chest. I do, Francesca whispered. Mrs. Alder nodded, satisfied. Then you hold tight to that. This life doesn't offer many chances. The woman left without another word, the door swinging shut behind her. That night, Francesca sat by her window, the book open on her lap, a candle guttering low. Outside, the wind stirred the tall grass, and somewhere down the road, a lone coyote called to the stars. When she woke the next morning, she knew before she even opened her eyes that he was near. She dressed quickly, pulling on her boots and hurrying downstairs. Quentin stood in the street, his clothes dusty, his hat in his hands. His eyes found her instantly. She crossed the distance between them without thinking, the packed earth warm beneath her feet. You're early, she said, her voice catching. Couldn't stay away, he said simply. Francesca reached for him and he caught her in his arms, lifting her clear off the ground before setting her down gentle as anything. I missed you, she murmured into his shoulder. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumb brushing the curve of her cheek. I'm here now. If you'll have me, I aim to stay. The morning sun lit the golden dust around them, the whole world narrowing until there was only the two of them. I want you to stay, Francesca said, her heart so full it hurt. Quentin smiled, slow and certain. Then we're home. He kissed her then, not rushed or desperate, but sure and steady, the way he had been with everything from the start. Francesca leaned into him, letting the trust she had fought so hard to build settle deep into her bones. The wind carried the scent of fresh turned earth and wildflowers, and somewhere nearby, a church bell rang out across the fields. Hand in hand, they turned toward the town, ready to build something lasting from all the broken pieces they had carried. The days turned warm and green, the prairie alive with the hum of bees and the slow stretch of growing things. Francesca and Quentin worked side by side, their lives weaving into the steady rhythm of the town. One afternoon, they stood behind the schoolhouse, Quentin driving fence posts deep into the soft ground while Francesca tied fresh rope between them. Children's laughter floated from the open windows, a bright, living thing. Francesca wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and leaned against the fence. This place feels different now, she said, watching a hawk wheel overhead. Quentin set down his mallet and crossed his arms, considering her words. Feels like a beginning. She nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep. Later that evening, they walked the edge of town where the fields gave way to wild grass. Quentin carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and Francesca guessed by the way he handled it that it was something of weight. He stopped by a lone oak tree and set the bundle down carefully. Figured you might want to plant something here, a kind of marker. Francesca knelt and unwrapped the cloth, finding a young sapling, its roots still damp from the riverbank. I thought we could put it somewhere that matters, Quentin said, his voice low. Francesca pressed her hand to the soft leaves, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. For my father, she said. And for whatever we build here, Quentin added. Together, they dug a small hollow in the earth. Quentin steadied the sapling while Francesca packed the soil around its base. When it stood firm, they sat back on their heels, the setting sun lighting the leaves with fire. Francesca brushed the dirt from her skirts. I never pictured a life like this for myself. Quentin pulled a small carved bird from his pocket and set it at the base of the tree. Neither did I. She traced the bird's smooth curves with her fingers. You made this. He shrugged, looking a little sheepish. Picked it up during long nights on the trail. Helps to keep my hands busy. Francesca smiled, the kind that came from deep inside. It's beautiful. He brushed a blade of grass from her hair, his touch light. So's the woman who's building a life with me. The words hit her harder than she expected. She stood, brushing off her hands. Let's go home. They walked back slowly, Quentin's hand brushing hers until she twined her fingers through his. The town glowed ahead of them, lanterns flickering to life one by one. That Sunday, they stood before the preacher in the small white church, the smell of lilacs filling the air. Francesca wore a simple dress the boarding house women had helped sew, and Quentin had scrubbed the trail dust from his boots until they shone. The preacher's words were plain, but Francesca heard every one like thunder in her blood. When Quentin took her hand, his thumb brushing the back of hers, she squeezed it, steady and sure. "You take this woman to be your wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Quentin said without hesitation. "And you, Francesca?" She looked up into Quentin's eyes, seeing not just the man who had pulled her from darkness, but the man who had stood beside her while she learned to walk in the light again. "I do," she said. Cheers rose from the small gathering, and someone clapped Quentin on the back as they stepped outside into the sunshine. The townsfolk had laid out pies and coffee under the cottonwoods, and the children ran laughing between the tables. Francesca and Quentin sat together under the oak tree behind the schoolhouse as the sun dipped low, the sapling they had planted standing firm against the evening breeze. Quentin brushed a kiss against her temple. "You happy?" She leaned into him, feeling his arms slide around her shoulders. "More than I ever thought possible." He tilted her chin up gently and kissed her, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that promised a lifetime. As twilight settled over Prairie Bend, they stayed there, wrapped in each other and the life they had built from hard beginnings and stubborn hope. In the years that followed, the sapling grew tall and strong, its roots deep in the good Kansas earth. Francesca taught the children of the town to read and write, and Quentin worked the land, his hands shaping fences and homes with quiet skill. They built a house on a rise overlooking the creek where the cottonwoods whispered at night. In the evenings, Francesca would sit on the porch steps, sewing by lantern light while Quentin whittled bits of cedar into tiny animals for the schoolhouse. Their love, like the tree they had planted, grew deep and sure, weathering every storm the prairie threw their way. And as the seasons turned, the town grew, and so did their family, filling the little house with laughter and the sweet, wild music of a life well loved. They never spoke much of the past. It lived in their bones, quiet and settled, but it no longer had the power to wound. Instead, they looked forward to harvests and dances, to quiet Sunday mornings and long rides over the open plains, to every ordinary, extraordinary day they had fought so hard to earn. And when the wind stirred the tall grass, Francesca would turn her face to the sky, hand tucked into Quentin's, and know with her whole heart that she was exactly where she was meant to be.